morning and welcome to Accelerate RegTech 2021, Reimagine from Full Stop to Future. I'm Ali Moore. I'm a journalist and a broadcaster, and I'm your host for much of this morning. Well, after having to cancel last year's conference at short notice, how good it is to be here. As Deborah Young says, the CEO of the RegTech Association, from Full Stop to Future reflects how it felt when everything just stopped last year. And then everyone just got online and got on with it and adapted. And that's what the RegTech Association has done with this year's program. It's a leading non-profit industry body, represents 170 organisations. And as Deborah also says, to describe this event as a labour of love is to sell it short. So while this year's 100% online and global program is designed around a series of short, sharp sessions, there's nothing limited about the range of global thought leaders and subject matter experts that you're going to hear from over 4 days and 4 streams. The aim of the program is to drive a narrative for RegTech, taking into account industry drivers, the impact of innovation in regulation, where the opportunities are for RegTech, and finally looking at banking innovation. In case you were in any doubt, the app that you've downloaded on your phone or your desktop and you're watching this on right now is your connection and your lifeline, not just to the speaker program, but also the RegTech City Expo. The 24/7 RegTech City is where you can engage with some of the world's leading RegTech organisations. And I'm told that they are ready and waiting. So do show your support by visiting. And the Expo is going to be open until the 25th of March. So you've got a bit of time to enjoy. A few points on interactivity. The app only allows permission-based contact. You only accept who you want to accept. Do post your pics on the wall. We want to see you. We want to know where you are. Some sessions will include live polling and live Q&A, so do join the conversation wherever possible, including the panel discussion that's coming up shortly, using the chat function. And just to note that the industry discussions and the masterclasses in each stream are member access only. For now, though, we are kicking off our big picture stream, where we'll look at the drivers for the way that we think about technology, the impacts on people and jobs and our economy, the investment environment, and why digital trade is going to be critical for economic recovery. It is my pleasure to invite the Honourable Dan Tehan, Australia's Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment, to do the formal welcome to delegates on behalf of the Australian Government and the Australian Trade and Investment Commission, our stream sponsor for today. Thank you, Minister Tehan.
Good morning and welcome to Accelerate RegTech 2021. The demand for technologically advanced compliance solutions in regulated industries like finance services, utilities and healthcare is accelerating. This is matched by the speed of change in global regulations to keep up with technology. Australia can leverage its capability in regulation technologies, or RegTech, to create new business opportunities and jobs and become a world leader in this growing field. As a nation, we are ranked 15th in the world and 5th in APAC for digital competitiveness. Australia is the world's 3rd largest RegTech hub and the leading hub in the Asia-Pacific region. And our RegTech sector is growing at twice the global average. The Morrison government is driving Australia to be a leading digital economy by 2030. Last year, the government announced an $800 million investment to help Australian businesses boost their digital capabilities, to grow productivity and create new jobs. We are boosting support for the sector by committing $11.4 million to deliver a RegTech commercialisation initiative over the next 4 years. Another $9.6 million will support Australian fintech startups to gain a foothold in international markets and encourage foreign investment and job creation in Australia. Australia's $9.5 trillion financial services industry is already benefiting from our investment and expertise in RegTech. We are seeing the automation of regulatory reporting, compliance monitoring, and RegTech helping to identify and manage financial crimes. Australian businesses in industries such as energy and healthcare are also realising the benefits of engaging with innovative RegTech businesses. We see enormous opportunities from greater cross-border investment and collaboration in this space. Australia can build on digital trade flows already opened by bilateral cooperation like the Digital Economy Agreement with Singapore, the UK-Australia FinTech Bridge and Australia's free trade agreements. Australia is blessed by its creative, resourceful, educated and enterprising citizens. These skills will help us become a global leader in RegTech to drive jobs and opportunities. Thank you.
Well, hello and good morning, everyone, and thank you, Minister Tian. I'd like to also extend my welcome to everyone to Accelerate RegTech 2021. And after the cancellation of last year's event, it's so great that we could all be here together, even virtually. My name's Duncan Taylor and I lead Microsoft's financial services business here in Australia. And I'm delighted to see what an amazing event Deborah and team have pulled together for us all to enjoy over this week and next. Before we get going, as this is a virtual event themed across Australia and around the world, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of country throughout Australia. We recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm personally coming to you this morning from the northern beaches of Sydney, so I'd also like to acknowledge the Gamaragal people of the Eora Nation in particular and pay my respects to their elders past and present. And I'd also like to welcome any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are with us virtually today. Microsoft has been pleased to support the RegTech Association and become a member since its earliest days. I remember sitting down with Deborah at Stone and Chalk in 2018 and discussing how and why we should become a member. At that point, the association, I think, had 62 members. And we fast forward to now, March 21, the association has over 170 members from across Australia and overseas. And the association is doing some great work. It's really helping RegTech businesses grow. It's also having a real impact on the advocacy and policy perspective by driving better regulation and compliance outcomes for a number of regulated industries, not just financial services. The association is also working to build trust, connect people, and really show the powerful potential of technology. Obviously, that's critical for us here at Microsoft as we continue to invest in cloud, data and AI capability that are really helping the RegTech revolution be made possible. The association has even come up with this taxonomy, this naming system in partnering with BCG that I think is very powerful to help the market really understand what RegTech means, how to engage in the various components of RegTech and drive a narrative in a consistent way. All this work is playing a key role in helping us build a strong RegTech industry and capability, and it's also putting Australia on the map. As Minister Tian said, there's no doubt that Australia is a leading country for RegTech innovation globally. For all these reasons, Microsoft's very proud to be the platinum partner for this event, as we have been for the past 3 years. As Ali mentioned, we all remember this event being cancelled last year, and now, along with most things in our life, it's been digitally reimagined, and I just encourage everyone to engage in the digital format. Ali mentioned the RegTech City Expo that runs 24/7, and the industry discussions that you can join via the Q&A on your conference app. So please take full advantage of the digital capability and make some new connections. I'd also like to acknowledge the enormous support provided by all members, speakers, sponsors and delegates to make this event possible, and I really wish and hope that you have a very successful conference. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce a good friend of Microsoft and now the RegTech Association, Professor Genevieve Bell, who's going to be our first keynote speaker. Genevieve is a distinguished professor and the Florence Mackenzie Chair at the Australian National University and a Vice President and Senior Fellow at Intel Corporation. Genevieve completed her PhD in Cultural Anthropology at Stanford University and is well known for her work focusing on the intersection of cultural practice and technology development. She's also the inaugural director of the 3A Institute the Institute has been co-founded by the ANU and CSIRO's Data 61 to create a new branch of engineering focused on scaling AI-enabled cyber-physical systems in a way that's responsible and sustainable. If that wasn't keeping her busy enough, Genevieve is also a non-exec director at CBA, a member of the Prime Minister's National Science and Technology Council, a fellow of the Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering, a fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities, an SRI International Engelbart Distinguished Fellow, and last but certainly not least, an officer of the Order of Australia. Genevieve, I'm not sure how you found time to be with us today, but I'm very glad that you have found the time to talk to us about technology, people, and the planet. And I know we're in for a real treat. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Genevieve Bell.
Thank you, Duncan. That is such a mouthful. It makes me realize that there's a reason why I spend my life living on coffee, surrounded by books I hope one day to finish reading. Listen, it's my incredible pleasure to be here. It's kind of funny to get to see my name followed by the words people, technology, and planet, because that's really where I like to locate myself. For the next 15 minutes, I want to do a couple of things. I want to tell you a story about our future and our past and reflect on what that might mean for us, and ask a couple of what I hope are questions that will buzz around in your brain and possibly not get to a resolution, because I sometimes think the job of kicking off an event is to ask questions, not always answer them. But I too want to begin where I am today, which is on the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people here in Canberra, Australia. And I too want to pay my respects to the elders, past and present, of this place, and to remember that it was always sacred and that it was never ceded. And for me, the responsibility of saying those words and of acknowledging where I start every day and where I start my work is hugely important. It's not only important because I think it is the responsibility of all Australians to do that work, but it's also important whenever we talk about the future to remember that as Australians in particular, we get to do it in a place where people have been talking about and building the future for 80,000 years. And more importantly, for me at least, at this particular moment in time, in a place where people have been building technical systems that have sustained over millennia for an incredibly long time. About 1,000 kilometres north of where I sit, on the border between New South Wales and Queensland, there is the Barwon River. Some of you, I'm sure, know it, and the town of Warriner, which I'm sure some people know too. In that town, the river flows, and in the middle of that river, there is a set of stone weirs, fish traps, that were built by Aboriginal people somewhere between 10 to 40,000 years ago. They followed the design of an ancestral figure of the local community there. His name was Biami. He created the architecture of that system, which is a series of stone yews that hold fish in this river ecosystem. What that system allowed to happen was for people to gather on the banks of that river from multiple different nations and to, well, talk, and I suspect engage in ritual activity, and I also suspect to make business around what needed to happen to play out their law and their culture. And in thinking about what it took to sustain those things, for me, is hugely important as we imagine building technical systems today in the 21st century. And the idea of building systems that need to bring together the ecological, the cultural, and the technical, and do it with a clear eye to sustaining human activity feels to me as relevant now as it might have been 40,000 years ago. And the fact that that system of weirs was probably used, well, last weekend, by the Aboriginal people for whom that is still their traditional country feels to me to be particularly important too. We should be building systems that sustain over time and continue to provide real value and use. But that's not the story I want to tell you. I want to tell you a different story. I want to tell you a story about a time when the power of computing seemed endless, and where every week and every month brought new advances in what the power of computing could do. And when the greatest minds of a generation across industry and government and scientific labs were all dedicating their effort to thinking about what those computers might do. And where every month it seemed there was a conversation about what the data was that could be computed by those machines and what kind of new decisions could be made, and how we could talk about automating critical processes and how we would do a better job with data-driven policies and data-driven decisions, and how we build new businesses on the basis of all of that, and how we would have new problems that needed to be solved, and how those problems would create new dilemmas. And we may need new regulation and new ethical standards, and certainly new kinds of work and new kinds of practice. and a time when the world was also facing a series of existential challenges about global crises and their aftermaths, about needing to reboot economic systems and social systems, about needing to change the way we moved across the planet and how cultures related to one another, and at a time when the future seemed infinitely brighter than the immediate past had been. Now, that description may in some ways sound a little bit like 2021, but actually that's a description of 1946 in America. And it's a description of a moment in time in 1946 when a collection of men and women from all over the world gathered in a hotel on Harrison Street in New York City, a place where they would gather repeatedly over the following decades, from 1946 to basically 1955. And in that 10-year cycle, they would attempt to work out what to do with the power of computing. Because remember, 1940s, the biggest computer in the world was the ENIAC. It was the size of the office I am sitting in, so basically think a shipping container. It required all the power in the universe, or at least the power of 6 suburbs to operate the ENIAC. Lived in Philadelphia, and the people in Philadelphia would joke that you knew they were computing at the university when the lights in your house flickered. It required that much electricity. And the ENIAC was shrinking and shrinking, and computers were getting smaller and more powerful, and what they could do seemed extraordinary. And for the greatest minds of that era, mathematicians, philosophers, logicians, psychologists, biologists, anthropologists, the conversation was about what on earth are we going to do with all that? And more to the point, how should we think about it? Because even back in 1946, the people who gathered to litigate our future understood that it wasn't just about computers. And the conversations by necessity had to involve people who came from other places, because they recognized that those conversations also needed to involve humans and the environment in which all of that would happen. Because remember, 1946, we've just finished World War II, and we have understood the power of technology wielded in the right hands and the wrong hands. We've understood the consequences of the use of new technologies and what would happen if they weren't regulated appropriately or those laws weren't enforced. And so sitting around the table at this first conference in 1946 were many, many different kinds of people. And the conversation that unfolded wasn't one just about what computers would do, but about how humans would be in and out of the loop of computing, about what kinds of humans would be there and how they would think, about whether computers were just going to be about productivities and efficiencies, or whether they'd also be about creativity and beauty and art, about how all of those things would mimic or not mimic the biological world, and about what the consequences of computing might be for that biological world. How would we power those computers? How would we build them? Where would we put them? What were the kind of things they might do? Most of us don't remember those conversations. Most of us don't remember the events that they took place at. But that set of conversations were enacted by a large American philanthropic foundation. They were called the Macy's Conferences on Cybernetics. And that term cybernetics was coined to describe the notion of a system that would by necessity need to incorporate technology, humans, and the environment. And for the men and women gathered at those events, they couldn't imagine talking about technology, in that case computers, without also talking about the human and the ecological. And that feels as radical in 2021 as I think it did in 1946. In between those two moments in time, we've lost many of the conversations that were started by Norbert Wiener and Gregory Bateson and John von Neumann and Licklider and Mead. We've forgotten some of the conversations they had. We have instead focused on technology and what it means to build technical systems. We have not done a particularly good job of shepherding the ecological cost of those technical systems through the conversation. And we have thought somehow that the system was absent the human, such that we can now have conversations about what it means to put, quote unquote, a human in the loop. 2021 marks a very long time since those conversations took place. It also marks for me an unexpected new beginning. As of the 4th of January, I find myself as the director of the inaugural School of Cybernetics here at the Australian National University. I think that means it's the first School of Cybernetics in Australia. It's probably not the first school in the Southern Hemisphere, but I'm willing to bet it is the first School of Cybernetics on the planet that's been run by a woman, and certainly by an anthropologist. So why are we doing that? Well, we're doing that because it turns out one of the things that's really clear in 2021 is that the system composed of humans and technology and the environment is one of the most significant units of analysis that we will see for the next, I suspect, century. But the idea of talking about the world in pieces clearly doesn't explain the year we've come through or the path we're going to need to weave out of it, or the ways we should be thinking about everything from regulatory frameworks to economic development to cultural process and justice and fairness. So for us here in this new institute and new school, the notion of the system as the unit of significance, the unit of analysis, the unit of intervention, the unit of creation feels hugely important. And thinking about how we approach analyzing and building and critiquing and regulating and maybe even disrupting those systems feels like really important work. And much like my forebearers back in the 1940s, I know to approach those problems, that notion of the system and of building a system that encompasses those pieces means you've got to have a diverse set of voices in the room. I look around this new school and I see computer scientists and systems engineers and civil engineers. I also see anthropologists and lawyers and artists and people who have backgrounds in economics and theatre and physics and photojournalism. I look around all of that and I see people who've worked in the public sector and the private sector, who've worked for themselves and for big organizations. And I see a set of lived experiences that thread together the entire planet. One of the things I know about running places like this and of building systems that by necessity include disparate pieces is that we have to be willing not just to talk about diversity, but to talk about inclusion and belonging. And more importantly, to talk about how you manage conflict. Because it turns out when you bring people together who have all those different backgrounds, they don't agree about very much as a starting point. So how we imagine building a world of people, technology, and the planet also means how do we sit with discomfort? How do we make that discomfort productive? How is it that we find ways of talking and thinking and being different? Feel to me the critical challenges. So what are the questions that leaves us with? Well, I think one of the questions it leaves us with is the question about how would we take a systems view to everything? And not a system in the technical sense, because most systems aren't just technology. Most systems have humans in multiple loops around those systems. Most systems don't end with the metal. Most systems are back-ended by environmental resources. They impact humans. And so how we take a step up and a step out and say, even as we think about things like a regulatory framework, what is the system that we are imagining there? What are its intended and its unintended consequences? How do we think about all the component pieces and how do we find a language to articulate all of that? So question number one is, what does it mean to think of things as a system? I think the question number two is, how do you then think about the pieces of that system? How do we think about humans in that system as citizens, not just consumers? How do we think about them as cultural creatures, not just citizens and consumers? How might we unpack all of those complicated pieces? How would we think in places like Australia about, well, the complexity of managing multiple competing and non-commensurate viewpoints about those systems, be it Indigenous and settler culture, be it commercial and governmental agendas that don't always line up? How do we resolve some of those systems as we build out next generation systems? And how in all of those things do we do it in a manner that reminds ourselves that building, particularly where I sit, AI systems, consumes an inordinate amount of energy and requires just a lot of thinking carefully and creatively about how we do those things. So where does all of that leave us? Well, as usual, it leaves me with more questions than it does answers. I listened to the Dean of Architecture and Design at MIT recently, and he said to me, he thought one of the challenges that we faced in the 21st century was that engineers wanted to solve problems, and he thought we needed people who knew how to resolve problems. And for me, that tension between the solution and the resolution feels particularly pertinent, as does the tension between asking critical questions and then actually enacting critical doing. So my commitment is that as I start this new school, I'm committed to building a world in which many voices are present, in which we think about systems, and in which I don't just lock all the knowledge up here in this place. I want to share what we're doing as widely and as equitably and as radically and as quickly as I possibly can. So I guess I have an ask for everyone listening. Two asks, really cheeky of me. Number one is, we're building a new school. If there's people who you think absolutely should be here, will you send them to me? Because I want and need all the help I can get. My exchange for that is that along with Microsoft, I've been partnering to create some education opportunities. So sitting on your RegTech app, there is the Microsoft AI Business School, and we're offering a masterclass around AI. So if you want to hear me explain AI, which is always kind of entertaining, Anthropologist does AI, you can find it right there. And I think my last request to all of you as you go through the rest of this event is to keep thinking about what it means to imagine building a system that by necessity includes regulation, but must also include the humans that regulation is enacted upon, the technology components that will be part and parcel of it, and the ecosystem and world that we all live in. And those feel like weighty questions and important questions, and ones that, frankly, I suspect everyone who will tune into this webcast over the rest of the arc of its unfolding are infinitely qualified to tackle. So with that, I want to stop and say thank you.
Genevieve, thank you so much. Just an extraordinary presentation, and so many questions that I think are really relevant for this audience and really relevant to today's conversation. And I should tell you, I do have a message on the chat function, Professor Bell for president, once we become a republic. So there you go. But I think that point about systems, and the fact that systems are not just technology, they're the combination of humans and technology and the environment, and how we think about that, particularly in connection to developing systems for the future. It's a really good segue to our next speaker, because he very much has the human at the forefront of the technology, and he had his head around the future of work long before it was a thing, with a really clear impact, really clear view about the impact of technology on jobs, but also the fact that when companies were introducing new technology, they very rarely brought their HR departments into the room. So Michael Pritter set up Fathom, which now delivers AI-driven insights to clients in 21 industries in 26 countries. And the enterprise product that Fathom has describes the impact of automation on every job in any company worldwide. And just to give you an idea of the scale of demand for this, with the new reality of COVID, not so new now, Fathom expanded its headcount 160% last year. So welcome to the virtual podium, Michael.
Thank you. Good to be with you. Thanks for the invitation to take part.
It is. I know that you were listening to Genevieve as well, and it is I suppose that goes to the core of what you do, isn't it? That you started because it seemed that people were being left out of the technology implementation process.
That's right. So my previous work, I was a partner at the Boston Consulting Group, and so I spent many years working at pretty senior levels across many industries in about 25 countries. Mostly around Asia, but also Europe and North America, building early emerging, what we now call emerging technologies. And when I'd hand over the results to clients, I'd really be talking to the CEO, CMO, CTO, CDO, CIO, and so on. The HR team were rarely in the room. And back then, this is 2010 through 2013, 2014 or so, HR was really a fulfillment center. It didn't really have a seat at the strategic table. This is before future of work or fourth industrial revolution with things. So I proposed to the CSIRO that we run some research, and BCG ended up sponsoring a 9-month research study to look at the impact of emerging technology on Australian jobs and industries. That then led to discussions I had with BCG. I initially pitched the idea for building Fathom within BCG, but ended up leaving to set Fathom up externally. We now partner with BCG, and just a bit of a side plug for BCG. They're bringing out a major report on Thursday this week, looking at the effect of jobs in the era of AI. The report will be published on Thursday. It does a deep dive into the effect of technology on jobs, including RegTech, in Australia, Germany, and the USA, and Fathom is the principal data source for that. So we've done a lot of work with those big consulting firms worldwide in the last few years, and as you kindly mentioned in the introduction, now serving clients in 26 countries. What I thought I'd do is really sort of focus on some of the key messages that Genevieve's just mentioned. Genevieve and I have had quite a lot to do with each other over the last few years, and it's always amazing to hear kind of weave together the human, the environmental, the technological. What I want to do is focus on the impact of technology on jobs. And what does that mean for those of us who are in the RegTech industry in terms of deploying those technologies, or representatives of large companies or government dealing with the introduction and the effect of those technologies and trying to understand what does this mean for our organizations, our business processes, and our workforces. I want to focus on a couple of key messages. Firstly, what are the actual, as opposed to the kind of the media hype, what is the actual risks, issues, opportunities of what's become known as the fourth industrial revolution? What are the key things that people can take away? And then, because we've got such a data-driven kind of vantage point of observing how leaders in organizations of really every sort and every industry worldwide are dealing with this, where does Australia stand with regard to this issue in contrast to other comparable countries? So quite a bit to get through, but really the key headline messages here is that this is not the end of work. There's this kind of perception that we've all been taught to think about, that the introduction of technology like RegTech leads to automation and jobs disappearing. That's a bit sort of simplistic. There will be an automation effect. Clearly, RegTech is automating jobs, automating processes, but there's an awful lot more that's happening as well. We look at three main effects: automation, augmentation, and addition of new tasks. And because we have this data-driven, holistic view of the effect of technology on jobs, what we can see is that while some tasks are automated in some areas, they're augmented in others and created in others. What this means is that this is not the end of work. This is not some sort of white-collar jobs apocalypse. Universal basic income is not the answer. This is a period of transition. The challenge for leaders of large organizations is that this is a rapid, at-scale transition that's happening everywhere. The key takeaway from this, therefore, is that the main effect is not how do we make people redundant with a conscience, or how do we deal with universal basic income type issues. The key solution here, and to borrow Genevieve's word, the key resolution here is to look at how do we transition people with intelligence in a data-driven way from the jobs they're doing today to the jobs of tomorrow. And I guess the business case around this is super simple. It is cheaper to retrain and redeploy than to make redundant and rehire.
And Michael, can I just ask you, I know that your philosophy is very much that your future employees work for you. They're just in different jobs. So in a very practical sense, what does that look like for a company? So if we take an example of a call center that's introducing AI technology or voice AI, why do I need my employees? Where would I put them? And over what sort of time frame? Because I can't just put them in a box while I develop a future job for them.
Absolutely. So call centers and the associated technologies like voice AI are quite common, I guess, analogs for people to look at and to say, okay, what does this mean across the organization? So conventional wisdom would have it that you put voice AI into a call center and you shed all those staff. But that's not actually what tends to happen. What happens is that voice AI is still not sophisticated enough to have every conversation with every customer. So it does automate some tasks that some of those call center operatives are currently doing. It does not mean that those people lose their jobs. What tends to happen is that those people are augmented. We free up their time, we give them some capacity, and they are retrained into doing more, higher order, higher level, more customer centric, better customer outcome type conversations. So it might mean that the voice AI, the chatbots and so on, take on some of those very elementary, where's my bill, where's my parcel, update my details, all those types of calls that the call center operatives used to take. But that frees people up, it augments them. What also happens is that it creates an awful lot of opportunity elsewhere in the organization for new capacity, for the application of that data, for new customer-centered insights to be derived from the data mining that results, and so on. So net, it tends to lead to more jobs. And this is a trend that we see, across industries. So I could give you examples in mining or farming or, pretty much any industry. When technologies come in, there is an automating effect. The outcome, though, is to create more work. The good companies, and when I say good, I don't mean socially good, although that is part of it. I mean companies, organizations, leaders that are really thinking about it, have informed that transition in a data-centric way so that ahead of time, they can say, okay, well, this person is going to be augmented. Across a team of 100, we might realize 30% or 40% capacity gain. conventionally we would shed those people, but actually what we're going to do is retrain them. We're going to upskill them, reskill them. We're going to give them new capabilities, and we're going to redeploy them for higher levels of productivity and a better overall effect. So we get the efficiency of technology, but we also get the productivity gain of redeploying those people.
And you make the point that there's a really obvious case for that, because it's a lot cheaper than actually, getting rid of everyone and then rehiring everyone. I wonder to what extent COVID's been a game changer in both parts of this conversation. One, just the adoption of technology more generally and the realization of, the need for speed. And then on the other hand, being able to also at the same time think about what that means for jobs. I mean, how many companies have moved forward on the former, but also managed to connect it to the latter?
So, I mean, people talk about COVID being an accelerant. We, for 12 months now, have referred to COVID as having a slingshot effect to 2023. So, we were working with companies worldwide in 2019 that were looking at early automation experiments. And so they were kind of considering voice AI, considering robotic process automation, considering RegTech probably. What happened at the beginning of COVID is that everyone kind of reacted very, very quickly. And they went, okay, we don't know how long this is around for. It's clearly not a good thing. We need to consider, the sustainability of the organization. We're going to accelerate the deployment of these technologies. What we did not see, which I think was partly values-based, but also really some of the messages I've just said sort of playing through, is this did not lead to lock, stock and barrel large numbers of redundancies. There were redundancies, but they were usually for economic reasons. For example, in the US, where they shed 40 million jobs, that was more to do with the nature of stimulus and the fact they didn't have a job keeper or furlough scheme. So what happened was that companies accelerated the introduction of these technologies. Those technologies were really operating at a level of scale that we weren't expecting to see until 2023. But companies did not want to contribute to the social issue, the community issue that COVID was clearly causing. There's this phrase that we've all heard many times now: we're in this together. And so I think what that did is it dialed up some of the values-based calculations that companies were thinking about. So as they deployed these technologies, they were looking for opportunities for them to be augmenting rather than automating. One of the effects that we saw, and that we can talk about because they've been very public in the media in the UK about this, is with Zurich Insurance. So Zurich became a global client of Fathom in June 2019. So I went to Zurich's head office in Zurich in Switzerland. We met the senior HR and technology leaders. We deployed Fathom. They were able to start looking at the effect of their technology agenda. And then in November last year, so just 2 or 3 months ago, they published in the UK, and there was a big article in the UK media, that Zurich had used Fathom software to retrain 3,000 UK employees for jobs of the future. And, partly because I'm English, but partly because, this is why we set the business up. It meant a lot, 3,000 people not looking for a new job in a pandemic. And I think that's pretty indicative of how we're seeing companies worldwide treat this. This is an opportunity for augmentation, for new learning, for skills development. It's not an opportunity to shed people into the job queue.
At the same time, of course, it's not a simple process. It's not necessarily an easy process. So what are the biggest risks or hurdles as you've seen them in practice to not just introducing and embracing new technology, but also keeping your workforce with you?
So, Ali, I think actually I want to kind of start pretty high level and almost challenge the notion of the period that we're in. I really dislike the term the future of work. I think the term is a risk. When you say future of anything to anybody, you're actually asking them to cast their mind forward to some sort of future state and make a decision about the unknown. And most C-suites, their tenure is sub 5 years. So on the law of averages, most people have got 2 or 3 years left. You say future of something to somebody with 2 years left in their job, and you say, oh, by the way, it's complicated, we don't have an answer, and it's an emotive topic. And what they're doing is they're nodding. What they're thinking is, this isn't my problem. This is
I'm kicking the can down the road. Someone else can have it.
So risk number one, the term future of work. This is not the future of work. This is the evolution of work. This is something that's very tactical. This is something that people can start working on today. This is something that people should start thinking about right now. And they should start thinking, okay, what is the next best job? Not in terms of, the next best action that we build software around, the next best job, the next best task for this person to be learning. Number one, it's not something that's happening at some point in the future. clearly the growth of the regtech industry over the last few years is solid evidence this is well underway today. Second terminology issue, again, I'm getting on my soapbox here, but I hate the term fourth industrial revolution. Revolution's a conflict word. Revolution is power of people against each other. Revolution is it's evocative of kind of, the Northern English smoky old towns, the matchstick men and matchstick cats and dogs, and all those sorts of kind of very evocative images that we have. There have been two instances in history when science and technology have changed every job for everybody, and we called them the first and second Renaissance. I don't see any reason why 20, 30, 40 years' time we won't look back on this period if we get this right and say this was a Renaissance, this was a humanization of work. That then leads to kind of some of the opportunities around these risks. Okay, if this is the humanization of work, what does that mean? What are the jobs of the future? What are the skills of the future? And the risk, therefore, Ali, is, what are the chances we might get this wrong? How do we understand this better? The way that I try and characterize it is by saying that computers are good at the jobs we find hard and bad at the jobs we find easy. What I mean by that is that we're not built as human beings to lift and carry heavy objects, to do calculations, to be processing units, to answer the phone repeatedly, to dig holes all day, to fetch things from A to B. We've always used tools to do these jobs. And it just happens at this point in evolution that the tools are getting better at those jobs than we are. But it's very, very difficult for hardware or software to do the things that are fundamentally human: care, compassion, ingenuity, being innovative, dealing with ambiguity and risk, being able to empower, create, or innovate, or iterate. These are things that are fundamentally human. And what we're seeing is a transition at scale and speed from that first category of jobs to the second. The problem that we have is that there's a lot of people doing that first type of work. The second thing is that it's difficult to look forward. It's difficult to look forward with confidence, and it's difficult to look forward more than 12 months because we have this kind of 12-month cycle that's hardwired into how we do business. Lastly, it's difficult to look forward without data. And so the risk that really what we're working on in Fathom is trying to build a very, very vivid data-centric picture as to what that future looks like in terms of the effect of technology, the supply and demand for jobs at any level of abstraction, from economy to industry to company to community to the individual. And to say, these are the pathways, these are the job corridors that allow people to learn new skills so that they're ready for jobs in the future.
And when you look at that transition process or that evolution and how it's working globally, how does Australia compare? Where do we fit? Are we quick off the mark, or given that, we've had 28 years of uninterrupted economic growth, do we tend to be a little bit relaxed and comfortable?
Yeah, well, Ali, unfortunately for many of the Australians on this call, there's about to be a bit of a critical assessment coming, but I'm critical constructively because I think this also sort of speaks to the opportunity. So maybe to kind of qualify my statement before I say it, what I'm about to say comes from the fact that, I've been working on this topic in multiple countries for 10 years. I'm a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Artificial Intelligence Council. And we're working with clients and governments all over all over Europe and North America. So there's a degree of insight and experience that informs this. As you say, 28 years of unbroken economic growth has not given us much muscle memory for dealing with adversity. And unfortunately, I think most of the reasons for that economic growth are systemic as opposed to the smart decisions we've made. So it's people in the 60s, 70s, and 80s arriving in Australia single, having children, so more mouths to feed. The world's biggest defensive moat that's protected us from challenger companies, a small economy characterized by oligopolies, which means low incentives to innovate, the resources boom, and probably, in my view, probably most consequentially, compulsory superannuation for 30 years that's put 10% of GDP into an investment bucket that really pays for everything. When we compare Australia to other countries, and I'm not going to compare to the US or to Israel or to Finland or South Korea or Japan or any of those countries, that's not fair. When we compare to Britain, France, Germany, particularly Canada, Australia is significantly behind. This is a criticism, but it's the opportunity. It's what we should be doing next. So in 2017, the Turnbull government, as we all remember, was not doing well when it came to innovation. That was one of the words that they kind of rejected. It led to, in the early 2018 budget, 30 million being allocated for AI research over 4 years between CSIRO and Department of Education. 30 million over 4 years. In 2017, the UK government was rated the government most ready for AI. In March 2018, Emmanuel Macron announced 1.5 billion euros to spend on AI research that year. That's 500 times what Australia allocated when we account for the size of the economies. And in October that year, Angela Merkel, not to be outdone by Macron, announced 3 billion euros to spend on AI research the following year in Germany. So the numbers are just completely different, even when we account for the size of the economy.
And Michael, we've only got 2 minutes left, but it's not just about government money, though, is it?
No, absolutely. I mean, the opportunity here is how government, industry, and academia come together on this issue now. We have exemplars we can look at. I mean, Canada is the country most similar to us around the world, geographically, population size, system of government, even 4 big banks. And the Canadians have got a completely different approach, and it really centers on how government, industry, and academia come together. So they have industry superclusters. They've picked winners. They've centered those industry investments in different Canadian cities. They've fostered immigration. So when we axed 457s, 14,000 people moved to Toronto in the same period of time as we were experimenting with TSS. They've invested in these supercenter innovation groups. So, for example, the Mars Discovery District in Toronto, which I'm an advisor on, and I recommend everybody to check out. And they've attracted billions and billions and billions of inward investment and skilled migration in. So the model's out there, and I think there's a strong need now for Australia to start looking at some of these, systemic groupings of industry, academia, and government together.
And you'd have to say RegTech is pretty well placed to help pull that together.
It's one of the things we're good at.
Well, Michael, thank you. It's hugely challenging when you look at how you build an ecosystem, and as you said, there is a model out there. It's just that we don't seem to quite be there yet. And in terms of all the issues that Michael has raised, we're going to delve into them with our panel now. Michael Prittis, thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you.
Now, joining us now to discuss, lots of those questions and also other global digital impacts and what it all means for RegTech are our panel. We have Cheryl Murphy, who is the Acting Chief Economist at Austrade, where she leads a team of economists and data analysts and engineers to guide government policy in the trade, foreign investment and tourism spheres. Good morning, Cheryl. Lovely to see you there on our screens. Duncan Taylor, of course, you've already met Duncan. He leads the team responsible for Microsoft's largest financial services clients and enables the deployment of cloud services and technologies. Duncan, good morning again. Good to see that you're still with us. Neil Stanford is the head of private equity and venture capital for Host Plus, which is a super fund, one of the super funds that Michael was referring to. It's got $55 billion in assets and over 1.2 million members, and it's a significant investor in technology. Neil, welcome to our panel discussion. And Rachel Graves also joins us. She is CEO and co-founder of Castle Point Systems. It's a leading Australian RegTech firm. Many of you probably are familiar with it. It's in the compliance, information security and discovery space. Rachel, welcome to you. So you can all imagine a big round of virtual applause for our panel. And just a note for everyone listening that you can ask questions through the chat function, and I will get to them a little bit later. So this would be so much easier if I could wrangle you all in person, but I can't, so we'll do our best. Cheryl, let's start with the big picture. Can you just draw us these big economic and trade trends that we're seeing in 2021 in what I'm going to call a COVID world? I wish we could say a post-COVID world, but we can't. Oh, we can't hear Cheryl. Cheryl, sorry, we'll just ensure that your microphone is turned on. Try again, Cheryl. No. All right, I can't control that with Cheryl's microphone. So Cheryl, I'll come back to you in just a minute. Duncan Taylor, we heard from Michael Prittis just before about the role that technology can play. And I wonder, from your perspective, where do you see the key roles in the future? We can all sort of name the current roles, but where do you see the key roles in the future?
Well, yeah, Michael touched on, I think he summed it up really well in terms of work becoming more human. And, there will be this shift in the workforce from, manual jobs through more automation, and work will be hopefully more meaningful. In Microsoft, we talk about this concept of the AI assisted professional. But obviously, in terms of where the jobs are going, to enable that transition, there's a lot more digital capability being built. And we know that if you talk to any reg tech, and that it's very difficult to hire digital skills. So I think there's a lot of the core, whether it's data scientists, AI developers, cybersecurity specialists, that there's going to be a lot of jobs growing in those areas. But increasingly, I think, if you think about if your typical professions, whether that's a business leader of a bank or a lawyer or an accountant, those roles also need to be technology enabled. You need to have an understanding of what digital capability can do to your profession and your business. And Genevieve mentioned in her opening this concept of an AI masterclass that Microsoft was partnered with Genevieve, and that is to sort of address that issue that Genevieve runs these courses with very senior executives who run our biggest corporations, to help them understand what the impact is going to be of digital and AI capability for their businesses, and the skills they need to develop now in themselves as executives and their teams to help enable this evolution of work as Michael described it. So I think there's clearly going to be more digital skills, but even, I think the blur between a digital specialist and a business person, that's going to become, more joined and fused together as well.
When you talk about, giving presentations to business and the AI masterclass, for example, this is not a choice situation, is it? It's not that you can sit there and say, well, if we choose to adopt this is the impact on our business. The point is, it's coming, it's here. You really have to get your head around it.
Yeah, I think that mandate is clear now. I mean, I think in the old world, if we can call it that, I was the business technology department over there, sort all this stuff out for me, and I'll just run the business. That's not the case anymore. Business is technology, and technology is business. And so business people need to, have, digital literacy to enable the future of their business, which is going to be digital. So, and that's continuing to play out, I think, in all industries.
Sharella, I think you've rejoined us now, hopefully with your microphone okay. Can I ask you about the big picture economic and trade trends that you're seeing?
Sure, you can hear me now, Ali?
You can, that's wonderful.
Oh, good, excellent. Good morning, and thank you. And I'm sorry about that interruption. Look, it's clearly we're in an incredibly interesting year again. On the positive side, of course, there's lots of good news. We've got the rapid vaccine rollouts starting throughout the world. We've got a lot of expansionary policy in global economies, and that's given forecasters reason to upgrade their outlook for the world. The IMF, for example, just recently increased its global economic projection to 5.5% for the current year. So that's up from 5.2% in its last lot of forecasts a few months ago. And the OECD similarly at 5.6%, so having revised that up 1%. So I guess those big organizations are really thinking a bit more positively about the year ahead, and also 2022 as well. We actually did see most of the major economies across the world record positive growth in both the September and December quarter, so kind of reversing what happened in March and June quarters. China was perhaps the exception there in the sense that it came back faster. And of course, being such a significant economy for us and many other economies, that's been really important to that sort of upside story as well. Australia too is recovering really well. We have had, we had lost about $36 billion in GDP through the March and June quarters of last year, and through the September and December quarters, we got about 30.5 billion of that back. So, we're doing really well in terms of our recovery. Global trade too is rising again. We can see that quite clearly in the actual trade data, in industrial production data, and even the more peripheral indicators like container port traffic. That's going up again now too, after contracting in the middle of last year. And again, the IMF pretty positive about world trade volumes there, expecting them to rebound by about 8% this year. It's been quite a different story, though, for trade in services and foreign direct investment. Global foreign direct investment fell by about 42% in 2020. That's obviously an enormous fall. That's more than the fall during the global financial crisis, and it means that foreign direct investment is actually around about the levels last seen in the 1990s, so a huge decline there. Services trade also has fallen by around about 15% in 2020. And those trends in the differences between goods and services, we can see those in the Australian data as well. So Australian goods exports actually rose by 14% in 2020, but in the year to January 2021, but service exports fell by 39% over the same period. So you can see really different trends going on there. And most of that, of course, is travel and tourism and education related, and of course is because of border closures and the restricted movement of people. I'd love to be able to tell you that digital services and services which don't rely on that movement of people have sprung up, but it's a very small category of our service exports, and there's no such thing as digital services in the balance of payments. So it is quite difficult to sort of see through that. But of course, we know that digital is embedded into many goods and services in trade, and even iron ore, which is an unprocessed raw commodity. But there's certainly many digital services that going into getting it out of the ground and shipping it. So,
Siobhan, can I ask you that? When we look at digital trade, what exactly are we talking about? Is it all the data flows that are so intrinsic to trade more broadly? You just talked about iron ore, for example. Is that what we're talking about? The data flows around, pretty much everything that we trade?
That's right. I mean, there's digital is, as I say, it's embedded in so many of our goods and services that we export. There is, as I said, there's no kind of category that we can say, well, that's a digital export and that's not. It's clearly not that simple. Having said that, we have had some estimates about the size of Australia's digital trade. No, those were done back in 2017, but they certainly show that digital trade around about that $6 billion mark, according to the Export Council, with some work done by Alpha Beta. So pretty substantial when we can actually put our hands around it.
And then when you put that in a RegTech context, given our audience, the third largest hub for RegTech product development in the world, how, from a trade position, from an exports and investment position, how does Australia leverage that position?
Well, look, I mean, you see there's a number of things that will drive digital exports going forward. And as you say, we're in a pretty good position there. Good old-fashioned demand is clearly exceptionally important here. Collaboration between regulators and also business can help. Government policy can also help, and also connection into other global markets. On that first point about good old-fashioned demand, well, we know that Australia's financial services sector has been a strong driver of demand in RegTech here in Australia, particularly following the necessity, I guess, of mandatory reporting and compliance processes, which have followed from the Banking Royal Commission. On the second point about the collaboration between regulators and business, when we look at ASIC, which are supporting RegTech trials, through their innovation hub, that's a really good example of where the two are working together. And then thirdly, on the government point, well, government is offering direct R&D tax incentives to help regtechs really develop and to test and to launch their products in Australia. So that's helping along there. And then also, something that sort of, I guess, straddles a couple of those sectors is the consumer data rights system we have here in Australia. That was started back in 2017, something that was prominent in, or has been prominent so far, mostly in the banking sector. And really that's just about consumers being given access to their own data, obviously. And again, regtechs, digital, all part of the system there, as you know, we really need both sort of security around that data and organization of that data. So there's certainly plenty of, I guess, drivers of Australian regtech going forward.
And looking, Cheryl, I'll come back to you a little later in the discussion, but Duncan, if I can come back to you now, because looking at all the drivers that Cheryl's just mentioned, are you, even against that backdrop, are you disappointed at the speed that the market's moved? You might have thought, looking at the opportunities a few years ago, that we might have been in a different position. Is that fair?
Look, I think it's fair on the one hand, but I think regtech, we've seen a proliferation of capability in Australia driven by the Royal Commission. From our perspective, I think the industry is only just at the very beginning of adopting reg technology. I think straight out of the Royal Commission, most of the banks remediated by doing what they knew, which is probably throwing more people at the problem. That was very expensive and it's not sustainable, particularly now with the COVID impact. And I think that's accelerating the mandate to drive innovation and do things differently with reg technology. But it is a pretty, extensive transformation for a regulated entity to, change their core operating systems and deploy modern technology. And I think the banks have been looking at point solutions, and increasingly we're seeing more of a transformation agenda needs to be driven. In the same way you might look at, the customer experience left to right, you need to maybe look at regulatory compliance left to right across a bank. So, on the one hand, you might say, well, it hasn't been as fast as maybe many of our delegates might like, but it's happening. We can see it. And I did quote Bill Gates at the pre-event last night, and I think it's relevant here to give us all hope. Bill Gates said, a long time ago, that we overestimate what we can achieve in 3 years, but we underestimate what we can achieve in 10 years. So I think we all need to reconvene at the Accelerate RegTech event in 2030 and see where we are then.
There are, though, and you just referred to it then, some real complexities, aren't there? Like, I know that you raised the question yourself that if you've got AI, for example, and you're using that for compliance, how do you verify compliance with an AI model? How does the regulator feel about that? What transparency do you need for trust? I know that the RegTech Association is very big on that, but when you introduce new technology, regulators have to trust what they're dealing with, don't they?
Absolutely. So are we going to trust a computer to make a decision, that affects a financial outcome? I think more so we're probably seeing a model of the AI assisted professional. So the AI takes a lot of the legwork out of the manual checking and tracing, and that enables the professional to make a fully, a better decision. But increasingly, I think there's a lot of, consideration around the ethics of AI, and there's regulatory considerations about, okay, how far can we go with AI capability driving decision making in the process of banking or financial services. And I think we're only, again, just at the beginning of that dialogue, which maybe comes back to a lot of the themes that Genevieve was setting up earlier in her talk.
And the other challenge, of course, is also funding. The recent BCG report that the association was involved in had the number that while we're third largest hub in the world, investment in local RegTech is actually down by 50% since 2018, while globally investments hit record levels. Duncan, can I just ask you, why do you think that is in an Australian context? And how different would it be if the funding picture was different?
Yeah, I think Michael summed it up very clearly for us. And there was an article back from 2019 where I think there was some research by the University of Adelaide, which sort of spoke to that as well, that we're falling behind our peers in terms of investment in AI. To be fair to the government, there are investments and initiatives in place. The Digital Technology Task Force that the Morrison government set up in 2019, and I think Minister Tehan talked about the $800 million investment through the Digital Business Plan that was announced late last year. Are we doing enough? I don't know. I think that's the question we need to ask ourselves. I think the case Michael made is probably not. And, this community needs to continue to agitate for continuing, investment to accelerate our skills planning in Australia and our AI investments. RegTech Australia, I think, has proven, the association has proven that there's the demand, there's the capability, there's the appetite. But it's going to, and I think that what COVID has taught us, if we can give ourselves some hope, is COVID, I think, was a great example of our response of government and big business, so really working together and collaborating. And I think that's probably, a similar working model we need to apply to the digital economy.
Well, talking about funding, let's go to the person who has got money. That's Neil Stanford. As one of the largest tech investors in this country, Neil, can you tell us a little bit about the type of investments that you traditionally make, but also a bit about the broader investment landscape right now?
Certainly. Thanks, Ali. Yes, we're certainly, I feel we're punching above our weight. We have about $2 billion committed to venture capital. About 1.5 of that is actually invested in the ground. And we've backed a lot of Australian venture managers. And it's quite interesting when I ran through our portfolio, there was actually quite a few investments I could identify as being related to RegTech or having some attributes of RegTech. We've got investments in agricultural robotics, robots that you can send off into a paddock, and you using AI will identify weeds in the paddock and kill those weeds. Spot application of either pesticide or herbicide. We've got, again, other sort of RegTech investments that covers the awards system. Australia's got a very complex awards system, helps companies make sure that they comply with all of the awards. There's a whole list of them. We've got satellite company that allows farmers to, using satellite imaging in terms of the crop and whether the soil is missing certain nutrients. So there's a lot that's happening out there, and we're certainly playing our part. And I think Host Plus has certainly been a leader in venture investment.
But Neil, it's interesting that you, well, first of all, I suppose we should point out that before you joined 6 years ago, there was no venture, was there?
That's correct, yes.
Pretty impressive, runs on the board. But you go through venture managers. So can you tell us a bit about the investment philosophy? So you're not actually going out and saying, I like that piece of technology, I'm going to back that. You're picking the manager and you like their philosophy. Is that correct?
Exactly. So Host Plus had invested in private equity and venture since the late 90s, but certainly when I joined Host Plus, we took a very active approach to investments in the private space. And it was really about selecting managers that had skill sets in particular niches. It wasn't that we necessarily identified RegTech or, we did try and sort of look for more nuanced, more niche strategies, but it wasn't, it's a real sort of a balance there between not being too narrow, but at the same time, making sure that there's a proper strategy and everything dovetails together in terms of the strategy, the team, the skill sets. And so we've naturally, I guess, looked for more innovative managers that are doing things differently, looking for investments and strategies that are differentiated from others out in the market. That was specifically because we took an active decision to move away from sort of more of those generic types of investments that had preceded it, that hadn't performed well. And I think
in fact, your performance demands that you're in investments that by their very nature are disruptors and step changes. Isn't that right?
Well, that's increasingly so. Because we've performed so well, it's increasingly difficult to find accretive investments, and we're finding ourselves doing more and more investments in growth investments and venture investments, just because that's where the returns are. So it's worked very well, and I think to highlight during the pandemic from last year, it was very hard to generalize the impacts of the pandemic, but what we certainly saw was a lot of our venture and growth companies performed extremely well, and I really put that down to the fact that, you know, when you've got growth companies that are growing at high growth rates, often they've got lots of optionality. There's a lot of avenues that they can go down in terms of building out their business, and if one avenue gets closed off, you know, there's plenty of other alternatives for them. But I think also too, those businesses are typically just more creative, more adaptable, more flexible, and that's what you needed in a pandemic environment. But I think increasingly in a world going forward, you know, more and more disruption, it just highlights that you know, the place to invest is in a new breed of companies and founders.
So I know that you haven't heard an enormous amount this morning, but do you see a role for super in supporting the RegTech sector? And I'm thinking both as users of the product, but also as potential investors, even direct investors working together. Is there a role for super?
Absolutely. You know, we've got a number of investments where we are both an investor and a user of the product. And you know, I was just reading the other day, I think there was some commentary about the fact that with the increasing burdens of compliance, you know, super funds are having to report the same information multiple times to different regulators to meet, you know, different requirements. And I certainly think that there is definitely a need for more collaboration from investors, government, industry. Absolutely, there's a lot of scope there.
And in fact, I've got a question for you from the chat, Neil, just a very specific one. Has Hostplus invested in any VCPE funds that invest across RegTech, across the RegTech sector? And if so, who are they?
Not specifically RegTech, I have to say, but we've backed a number of managers in the sort of deep tech space. They're often, you know, looking at investments in AI or incorporate elements of AI, robotics. So it's very hard to specifically say, have we invested or have we targeted RegTech? No, but we are covering it quite broadly with our managers.
In the future, do you see a point where you might seek out a manager that is more RegTech focused?
Look, I think absolutely in time that will probably come as the economy continues to get more complex, as investments become more complex, and, you know, we continue to look for more accretive investments. If the opportunities are there, you know, naturally, it's just an evolutionary aspect of one strategy.
I should just remind our audience that I am going to take questions, and so please do feed them through on the chat, and I'll do my best to get to as many as possible. If I can just bring Rachel in now. You are at the coalface, if I can put it like that. Can you tell us a little bit about Castle Point and what you do and why?
Yeah, for sure. And I think listening today really highlights why we do what we do. So we're solving that fairly universal problem of too much data, too many systems, and too many rules. So our product's designed to essentially read every word in every artifact in an environment, a document, email, database, chat message, extract all those key phrases and named entities, and tell the organization what they have, where it is, who's doing what to it, what risk it has, what value, and then finally what rules apply and whether they're being met. So that helps any regulated organisation, from government right down to not-for-profits and schools and law officers, to understand their obligations and how to apply them.
So tell us a bit about, I mean, we've heard about the difficulty, the funding challenges, for example, but my understanding is you had a slightly different experience because you're not really a typical startup. So tell us a bit about your growth journey, if you like.
Yeah, sure. So we started consulting in about 2012, and all of our clients were government and large organisations that we were essentially auditing. So my certifications are in audit, privacy, records management and security, and my co-founders are technologists. So together we were analysing sort of large-scale failures in government departments and organisations around information management. And what we saw consistently is that those projects certainly hadn't succeeded, but in reality they could never have succeeded with the technology that was available to those organisations at the time. So it became clear to us that we would need to help solve that problem, and the way to do that would be to come up with a solution that could manage any kind of information in any system, apply any kind of rule, but most importantly do that without any user impact, any impacts on the source systems, and without any impact on the data. What we found consistently was that, especially around compliance, even when it is to do with privacy and security and things that can have a really, high reputational or financial impact, it's quite hard to get organisations to buy into solutions for their regulatory compliance unless there is no downside. So that's how we architected our product. And luckily, being already well established as a government services provider, we found early adopters quite easily for our solution with our existing client base, and that's helped us grow really rapidly since we launched the product at the start of 2018.
It's interesting that Duncan was talking earlier about the fact that the case for technology is just sort of done and dusted, but you do make a point that you don't sell a tech story, do you? You sell a business story, and that's really key.
Yeah, that's right. It is key. There's a lot of technology to do lots of things, but that technology can create business problems. So we've seen a lot of compliance systems put in place that actually create real drag and inefficiencies on the business, and therefore they're not adopted widely and they're not used. And if they're not used, then they're not useful. So you actually have to make sure that you're addressing something that provides return and benefit to the organisation. Compliance should be something that we all just want to do inherently, but in reality it's not. And if you take a business case to an executive and say, yep, it's going to cost you $1 million to comply, and they say, well, what happens if we don't comply with our record keeping obligations under the Archives Act? You have to say 20 penalty points. And it's just not a sale, like there's no deal there. So you actually have to make it clear to the organisation that the reason why we have rules and compliance is because they are best practice. This is the best thing you could do for your business. And if you do it successfully, you'll get the best outcome. But you have to do that without any kind of downside, essentially, from a cost or impact or risk point of view.
And you just mentioned cost there. If you have an amazing product, and I know that you say that you only have to tell people about your product and they buy it, if you have an amazing product, can you charge whatever you like?
Look, our partners and investors and friends would tell us that we definitely could charge anything we like for this technology. But the reality is that we're moving into what I think is a disruption age, out of an innovation age. It used to be enough to have a fantastic new idea and break that mold with something innovative and people would buy it. But now we have Gen Z coming into the workforce. We've got our younger millennials who are born innovators. You give them a new technology, they will have innovated it before breakfast time. So everyone is innovating now. Everyone has great ideas and realizes that you can change the way you use technology and the way you do process. What you need to do now is disrupt, which means you have an innovative idea that's great, but it also needs to break down existing barriers. So one of those barriers is always cost. And if you look at regulated organisations, there's 1.1 million of them in Australia, and some of them have only 4 or 5 staff. They can't afford $1 million a year product. So if you want to address that market, those 200 million organisations around the world, you don't do that by selling $1 million product 100 times. You do that by selling a $100,000 product a million times. So I think that really needs to be the model going forward.
And if scale then becomes key, how fast do you have to move, and what are your sort of business imperatives as you grow?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And we do have to move very fast because there will be another disruptor who can learn from our negative IP, see what we do and skip the steps of learning that we had to go through and enter that market. So the strategy for us has to be to leverage partnerships. The pandemic really accelerated this step for us. We were starting to export in February last year when this all started. We had to cancel our flights for our launch in the UK. And that really brought forward the thinking around, well, we need to work with partners to do this. If we want to scale to, 15,000 implementations globally, which is $1 billion ARR for us, we can't do that here from Canberra. We want to stay here in Canberra and be based here. And we want to build up our team here. But the way that we can access the whole rest of the world and all those 200 million regulated entities that are out there is through people who already have a presence in that market and in that geography. So we've worked out a fantastic model. We're partnering with some of the big four and some smaller organizations, some large technology companies who have clients who have the problem that we solve and know that together we can solve that problem better and faster for them.
So would that be part of your message to other RegTech participants who are listening, that not trying to do it all yourself, I suppose, becomes an imperative in itself?
I think so, and there's a key point around providing a RegTech technology is that it must come with services. So the challenge with Castlepoint is, we can deploy it in under 10 minutes. We can have it in the environment and working straight away. But once it's read its first system, it has exposed spills, breaches, non-compliances, found troves of high-value dark data, and then the organisation has immediately lost plausible deniability around the risks that they're now carrying. So someone has to help them and provide a service and say, okay, well, now that we've discovered 261 current credit card details in the shared drive, what are we going to do about remediating that? And then next step, what are we going to do about re-engineering the business process that has caused that to happen? The partners are the ones who provide that service. So we have a very synergistic relationship with those partners. If you want to be a technology company, like us, and move away from services, which is our DNA, but we can't scale it to 13,000 clients around the world, you have to find someone to provide the services that come with that disruptive technology. And that's why the partnership model is so key.
Just a reminder to people, please do put your questions through the chat. You can all see if there are questions there, and we've got about 15 minutes more, and I'm very happy to take as many as I can. So do feel free to ask any members of our panel a question. Rachel, where do you see the biggest opportunities then? You've got this product that you're scaling. I'd like to say what next, but I'm guessing there isn't one thing that's next.
Yeah, there's so many more things that we can do. So we have a really interwoven R&D capability in our company. So we work closely with the ANU 3AI Institute. We work with other parts of ANU on research projects. We hire in graduates from those schools, and we work with research organisations like CSIRO and QUT. And that has to be part of what we do going forward. Having just built the product that meets the requirements and is addressing the problem is the first step. But there's so much groundbreaking tech and new ideas and new capability coming through that we really need to keep not just a weather eye on that, but we need to have a finger in it, I think, on that pulse, and be incorporating as much of that as we can into the product going forward. Most of our new ideas for what the technology should do actually come from the clients. So as they start to embed it in their business process, use it across more and more data sets and more use cases, they have more ideas. Hey, wouldn't it be great if we could generate a report that does this? Or what if we had some kind of dashboard that showed that? So constantly incorporating those new features is really what's keeping us busy at the moment.
And that's probably a never-ending process, I imagine.
That's right, exactly. But I think prioritising those features and lining them up with what drives value in that organisation, whether for them it's risk reduction or it's about efficiency or it's about improving their quality. If we can keep it lined up with those things, then it's quite easy to shake out what we should do first.
There's a question here which I will actually put to you, Rachel. It says, without local VCP funding support, a distributor strategy makes total sense. How can we support this strategy as a group of Australian RegTechs? And I know that you're a member of the RegTech Association. How do you support that strategy? How do you make it more available, I guess, to more people?
That's a good question. So for us, it has been really, really key to find those partners. And I think we've probably engaged with 50 or 60 to get 5 or 10 really good ones. We actually just this morning got notified of our first successful bid through a partner that was primed by them. And we met that partner only maybe 2 months ago. So the process can be quite quick once you get it started. There's some upskilling required when you meet those partners, not in terms of the technology, because that always vests with the company, the vendor, but in terms of the use case, how are we positioning this? What problems is it solving? And I think if we can find services organizations who are thinking about and teetering on the edge of maybe we should develop some kind of technology, maybe we should start reselling or white labeling something, actually think about a more kind of mutually beneficial arrangement like we have. It's been a new model that we've had to sort of explain. A lot of these partners have said, okay, so what margin do I put on it? And we say, well, you don't. Like, you get the faster time to benefit, you win the work, you get the ongoing pipeline of services, we get the license. It's a handshake deal, essentially. And I think now that more partners are open to that, then there's more opportunity for companies like us who are disruptive to get carried in essentially on their coattails into their market, but provide value for them and for their client that makes that service provider much stickier.
Duncan, can I bring you back and ask you for your thoughts on what you've heard from Rachel and particularly the partner model?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. That's sort of front and center from a Microsoft perspective. Obviously, Rachel's mentioned partnering with professional services companies, consultancy companies, and obviously that's an important part of the strategy. But there's also an opportunity to partner with big technology platforms like Microsoft. So we will work with our RegTech or FinTech partners from our scale-up programs, like, for example, Simple KYC, one of the delegates here. We help them develop their technology and their business through that scale-up program. And then at the end of that sort of partnering journey, I guess the pinnacle is to become what we call a co-sell partner with Microsoft. So the technology, the IP that you've developed is delivered as a service on the Microsoft platform to customers. And by achieving that co-sell status, effectively every Microsoft salesperson globally is incented to sell your product. And so that provides, scale to access other markets, new customers, and provides, that alignment and partnering together with Microsoft and a RegTech to go to market together. Obviously, you still need the professional services component there. So we're sort of acknowledging that. But, I think to answer the question in the chat, there's an opportunity to also partner with a Microsoft or another big technology partner as a way to go to market.
There's another funding question here. I'm not sure, Neil, I could ask you, and if not, maybe Duncan, but it just makes the point that that there is, digital software and services infrastructure like a tech venture, they end up more like a utility. Is there a gap in the investment landscape? That's the question. So the new digital software and services infrastructure is like a tech venture, but then it does become, as it develops, I suppose, something else. Do you see that gap, Neil?
It's hard to, I think naturally any sort of investment or industry has it develops a kind of a critical mass over time. It's a hard question to actually answer, really. I mean, how things get established are often, it's not a planned, we don't live in a planned economy. There's often that serendipity of how things come together and sort of chance. But I do think there's a lot of scope there and I think this is maybe a challenge for the RegTech Association to consider putting together a bit of a master plan about certain areas that could benefit from greater collaboration, because I think as a society we've got bigger societal issues, and a lot of companies, not only are they there to make a profit for their shareholders, but there's also a societal benefit for those companies existing. It's like the banking system. has got a societal benefit. It's the same superannuation system. There's a broader societal benefit. And I think as a nation, if we come together, whether it's government, industry, academia, in terms of more collaboration to actually identify these are challenges, whether it's climate change or whatever it may be, but to come together, because I think some of these bigger problems that need to be solved really do need more of that active collaboration. It's not just an isolated element, a company working by itself or a startup identifying an opportunity. Some of these bigger problems do need a much bigger, wider solution.
Rachel, you were nodding at the beginning of Neil's comments. Do you like the idea of a master plan?
Yeah, I think so. I think the RegTech Association's already done fantastic work looking at the industry holistically. We actually relied heavily on some of their early reports in developing our own business strategy, and that's all panned out really well, I have to say. So it's certainly an organisation that is right at the the beating heart of what's going on with RegTech and connecting that with these research organisations, partners and clients, and with foreign governments. So I think there's a lot more that we can do there to leverage that if we can just get some extra housing.
And I suppose from a broader perspective, investment and trade, Sherelle, something like a master plan, something that does draw not just all the interests together, but the interests together with government assistance. It seems that there's a lot being done in the space, but is it all necessarily being done in coordination? Sherelle, would you agree with the idea of a master plan?
Sorry, I was on mute again. Yeah, we'd agree. There's certainly been a lot of work done in this space. And before we were mentioning the digital business plan, for example, that the government announced in September last year. In that, there was specifically just over $11 million for RegTech commercialisation and direct support to RegTech firms to help businesses improve their compliance. And
that's also, still, to be fair though, Sherelle, that's still a tiny bucket of money, isn't it? It's a little cup of money, really.
Oh, certainly. Look, it's obviously part of a much bigger plan, but that is obviously directed specifically at RegTech. There's other measures there for FinTech, for example, which take that bucket of money up to about 800 million. But what I was also going to mention is the fact that as a country, we're also looking at ways to, I guess, make digital transfer of information easier. So I'm thinking here about the Digital Economy Agreement with Singapore and the Singapore-Australia FinTech Bridge Agreement. There's also the Australian-UK FinTech Bridge, which is now in its third year, and that's really helping, I guess, the transmission of international trade flows there as well. So I think there's a role for us to play, a role for the industry, but also a role for the whole economy and looking at those trade opportunities as well.
So we've only got 2 or 3 minutes left. So I just wanted to just quickly ask each of you, if you were, well, I want to say running the country, but in fact, I don't mean from a political point of view. I just mean if you could pull any lever that you wanted to pull and it would be successful, what do you think we need to do in Australia to see RegTech fulfill its potential? And if I could just ask you to be quite brief with your answer, because I'm quite sure you could all write a PhD dissertation on this. Duncan, what lever would you pull?
Look, I think number one for me was increasing investment in digital skilling across the country. That will obviously impact RegTech, but a broader range of industries. And I think that's the number one issue we're sort of facing into.
All right, Neil?
I think a willingness just to come together. Collaboration for me.
Of which you would be very happy to be part of.
Everyone's got to bring something to the table. Exactly.
And Neil, I reckon your inbox is going to be full in about an hour's time. Sherelle?
I do agree with the point about actually skills. I think that skills are really important here. So sort of being able to upskill our labour force to ensure that we, we can make the most of the opportunity, because I think the opportunity certainly is there, and we certainly want to see that squandered by the fact that we don't have the workforce to implement it. So I'd say labour force, yes.
Rachel?
Yeah, I agree with that. And one step further, there will be people who don't fit into the traditional jobs that we have now. AI will take a lot of jobs. It will transform jobs that we can be reskilled for, but it will also replace a lot of people power. So we need to think about all jobs in the economy and think about how we increase the value of jobs that we currently devalue, like maybe spending time with people in aged care homes. That should be something that we can redeploy humans to, that we'll never get AI to do, that currently isn't thought of as something that's a viable option.
And Rachel, there's one other thing that I know that you've said to me in another forum, which I think is really significant, particularly for RegTech, the call for a culture change.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We need to think differently about compliance and regulation and realise that it is for everybody's benefit. It's not something we need to find workarounds for or avoid or even automate to the nth degree. It's something we need to integrate into our planning and process.
Look, an enormous thank you to our panel this morning for their insights and so much to take home, and well, many of us are home, but to digest and to think about. So, and also to continue talking about in the future sessions of this conference. Sherelle Murphy and Duncan Taylor and Neil Stanford and Rachel Gross, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, I think there is an enormous amount of information there. I mean, the whole idea of funding struggles, the need for maybe a master plan for greater collaboration, which was definitely Neil's view, the idea of building a bigger skill set, the overarching idea of maybe a culture change. I'd like to bring in now Deborah Young, who I referred to you earlier. She's the CEO of RegTech Association. I know many of you do already know her. She's the founding CEO, and she's the one who was responsible for building this organisation from 0 to 170 members. Deborah Young, hello.
Hello, Ali, how are you?
I'm good. You've got your work cut out for you, haven't you? If you haven't done enough already.
Yes, I was just listening to that session and I love the idea of a master plan. And I think to Neil's point, there is a greater societal benefit. In fact, I put something out on social media last night saying that RegTech is actually all about people and trust. And I think it goes to the points that have just been made about skills and investment that's required in order, for us to get there with RegTech.
And clearly the opportunity is there. I mean, for me, one of the overwhelming messages out of this morning is that, yes, there are challenges, there are things being done, we need to do more, but there's just massive opportunity. The business case almost writes itself.
Yeah, no, indeed. And I think Neil was right on the money again when he used the point about collaboration. This is going to require all of us with the shoulder to the wheel to actually get this to work. So that's the investors, it's the big tech companies, it's the small tech companies, it's government, it's all parts of the ecosystem, need to come together to make this happen. So I didn't write Neil's script today, but I could well have done. So thank you, Neil. Right on the money with your comments.
Mm-hmm. Well, we will close this session now. Deborah, I know that you'll be back with some member-only discussion points a little later and then back tomorrow.
Yes, indeed. Just before we wrap up, if you're a member or a guest of the RegTech Association today, you can now go to our second live stream, which will become live in the next few minutes once we disappear off here. And it's there that we're going to be discussing exports, trade, and potential of new markets for RegTech. This is your opportunity to get involved, get engaged. We're going to be actively driving some discussions in that session. If you're not joining us for that session because you're not a member of the association, please do use this as an opportunity to visit the RegTech City Expo, where the teams from those export agencies actually are going to be online 24/7. Following the discussion, we're then going to move off to a masterclass, and I'll introduce that a little bit later. But once again, I invite you to join that session, really engage, contribute in that via the chat and to learn. And I'd just like to thank Ali Moore very much for her very capable Master of Ceremonies this morning. Ali will be back with us next Wednesday for the new economy. So we're looking forward to seeing you again then, Ali. And in the meantime, for those of you who are leaving us now, please tune in tomorrow for Regulation Innovation session, where KPMG will be on board to take us through some provocative keynotes and an industry panel. We'll also finish with another industry discussion and masterclass as well tomorrow. So for now, I will see you all on the other side. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ali.
See you soon.